Here we are at the third phase of the American Revolution, and this is the battle for the South. So once again, the British strategy has changed for the third and last time, and now they're going to try to attack and take the port of Charleston, and they will, in South Carolina, and they will move into the South. A little short preview of one of the guys that quit the American war effort, and his name was Benedict Arnold, and he would desert the American revolutionary effort in 1780. So I just want to say a few things about him because he's very interesting. Just like George Washington, he's the polar opposite, right? He's the guy that fought with the Americans and then he gave up the American cause and joined the British. So you never want to be called a Benedict Arnold. That means you're a big traitor. But he and his family were businessmen from the West Indies, which is basically the Caribbean. And so they did a lively business between the West Indies and the New England region. So his background was in that business trade. And so he was very active in the American colonies when the Stamp Acts and the Sugar Act were passed. And he joined the Sons of Liberty. So he did actively support the American cause. He was the general, the Benedict Arnold that I referred to in the first American or colonial strategy to invade Canada. He was the general that led one of the prongs that went in. He conspired with the British to hand over and or defeat, I guess if you have it, West Point. So he was a West Point grad, and he told the British that he could ensure that a military commander could take that West Point position, and he would hand it over. Now, this didn't happen, right, but he did plot to do it. They say that he was to get somewhere between, one source I read, 8,000 pounds for it, and the other one said 20,000. So I'm not sure exactly how much he was going to be paid for it, but he definitely exacted a price from the British. So he was part of the invasion of Canada, and he would then later join the British in 1780. So that's Benedict Arnold's background, right? So he's a commercial interest, and he was part of the colonial cause, and then he joined the British. And I'm not sure why, because if you look at the Battle of Saratoga, which was won in 1777, you're 3 years or so later, and he's decided to join the British when it doesn't look like the British, the cause for the British is going to be won. But anyways, that's Benedict Arnold, right? And just a little bio preview for as we move south into the final failure of the British strategy, right? So the British invade the South, right? And this is their last effort, and they think there's going to be enough loyalists down there that will help them defeat the revolutionaries, and then they can take one colony after the other back as they move north. Now, many books state or claim that he overestimated loyalists' ability to help him. That's probably true, or even loyalists' will to help him. In this third phase, too, we get Arnold becomes a traitor, so he joins the British cause. They start the third phase of this battle against the colonists in the Carolinas, and like I said, they take Charleston, South Carolina, the port first. They will face a wily character in the colonial command, Nathaniel Greene. And he is a Quaker, and he is known as the Swamp Fox because he takes the British into the marshy areas of the South and, as we know, the Chesapeake, where there's so much death and disease, and again, the terrain is really vegetation is very heavy and very tough going. And so he's called the Swamp Fox because he led them on in he would retreat and then run little skirmishes against the British, and he encouraged them or drew them around through the swampy regions in the south, and so they called him the Swamp Fox. These are classic delay tactics in military. So instead of fighting, in other words, a formal battle on the battlefield, although they did have a couple of those, most of it was a retreat and ambush strategy by Nathanael Greene. And the fact that he's a Quaker is interesting only because Quakers are pacifists, so they don't believe in war at all. But this then Southern effort, Nathanael Greene basically tires out the British Army, and then they are going to have to figure out how to get resupplied. So the Navy and naval warfare will become very important. Now, the Americans don't have much in a Navy, although they build quickly merchant marine. They do have a Navy commander, John Paul Jones, so if you've ever heard his name, that's why. And he leads a merchant marine, and he doesn't do too bad. He captured about 600 British ships of all types. So that's a pretty good record, but still it was hard for him to face anything, any formal British Navy. I mean, he couldn't face it en masse. So he needed the French help, and the French would send Admiral de Grasse at the right at the last moment to help out the Continental Army as they faced the British at Yorktown. So Admiral de Grasse is a French admiral, and he was on commission down in the Caribbean, and he was given word to go to the Chesapeake to help out the Americans or the colonial cause. So he's French. He will cut off the Chesapeake, the British fleet from the Chesapeake, so they couldn't resupply Yorktown and the British troops at Yorktown. So Yorktown is the last battle and the last success for the Americans. In this map you can see Yorktown at the top. Let me get my pointer out here. Right here, so you have York River across here. So this is the river on this side. On the right side, the British were hoping to come up and resupply British troops that are identified here with these black dots here on the coastline here. And that was Yorktown. It was a very temporary, quick British encampment. They built walls, walls as such. I mean, wood logs around to as walls, as defense against troops. And then out here, outside of Yorktown, you can see the American and the French troops, and they're kind of obviously named. For example, if you're down here, you got Virginia troops, Maryland troops, Pennsylvania troops, New York, Rhode Island, and all this side really is Americans. Here we have Lafayette helping George Washington out. But here you can see that there's lots of troops from the French. So you've got French artillery down here. Rochambeau is running the whole siege. This is what's important about Rochambeau. He was a siege expert, and he would help the Americans to defeat the English here at Yorktown and lay siege to Yorktown. And then you can see the French troops, Saint-Simon, Touraine, Soissonnaz, Viscount, Villemenil. Anyways, lots of Bourbonnois, lots of French units here on this side, Touraine. So that's how they were arrayed. Americans on the right and the French on the left. And Rochambeau running the siege against Yorktown, and this would be victorious. So General de Grasse is going to show up. This is York River runs into the Chesapeake, and he would cut off the Chesapeake so the British couldn't come up into the Chesapeake and go up the York River to resupply General General Cornwallis at Yorktown. All right, so the British were led by Cornwallis, and he had brought his troops to Yorktown for some reprieve and to wait for supplies to come up the Chesapeake and up the York River. Yorktown was very much a makeshift fort. The siege that Rochambeau lays on the port works. Colonial forces were led by Washington, and then we see Lafayette and other generals on that. And Rochambeau is the mastermind of this siege. So he was, again, a siege expert. And the Admiral de Grasse, so two French commanders were absolutely important to the victory at Yorktown. De Grasse cut off the Chesapeake. Rochambeau organized and planned the siege of Yorktown. And the British would surrender at Yorktown. And now the Americans went to Europe to sign peace with the European powers. And the Americans are very clever because they send their diplomats, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay went to Paris to sign a peace, and the Americans quickly signed a peace with the British and did not wait for a collaborative peace with the Spanish and the French, and they would define the boundaries of this new American nation from the Atlantic to the Mississippi River and from the Great Lakes to the northern Florida border. And that was the territory that they would claim as the new, and they would become the United States, but that was the new nation. And they signed this deal with the British without consultation with Spain or with France, even though both Spain and France helped the American war effort, France probably more than anything, and so that it was expected that they would wait for that alliance, and they did not. And so they signed a treaty with England very quickly, right? And that was the territory. Now, once again, just like with the Spanish claiming all of the Latin Americas and even beyond that, it's a matter of whether you can maintain that territory. So from the Atlantic to the Mississippi, from the Great Lakes to Florida, there's lots of holes in those regions that the Americans would have to have a military so that they could claim that territory and keep that territory as theirs. All right, so why did the British come? They wanted to secure their territory, secure their colonies. What would they do was not clear, but they had one thing to their advantage, a professional army, and this advantage wasn't going to get them anywhere because the Americans had a lot to their advantage. The British suffered from changes in strategy, so they start in the north. That fails. There's too many patriots. They go to the middle to divide and conquer. That fails. Their military is defeated at Saratoga. And then they go to the south, hoping that there's enough loyalists to aid their military. And they are defeated at Yorktown once again. So that strategy was changing through the war, and that's usually a problematic war effort. If you're you have to be, of course, agile, but so many changes in the war effort. The hearts of the patriots and the fact that they were successful, strangely enough. I mean, they couldn't win a formal battle, but their military was making it very difficult for the British, and I guess that was as much of success as you could get. So the hearts of the patriots, they didn't have, and this was only part of a broader war that they were running mostly against France. So England and France were all over the globe fighting each other, and so they didn't have necessarily the resources to put into this battle effort. Although sending 30,000 troops to New York in the second phase of the war was quite a large military to have on the American continent to fight the colonists, right? When they left was 1783. They finally accepted the fact that they would sign a treaty at Paris. And I'll leave you with a question in this lecture. Now what? Right? And that will lead us to our next lecture, which will be the Americans attempting to start government under the Articles of Confederation, which are already written in 1777, so they're functioning in this war effort under those Articles of Confederation. And they would decide they needed a new constitution, that the Articles of Confederation were was wanting in some way, shape, or form, and that will be our next lecture. And then we'll go on, once we get the Constitution, to look at the first administrations of George Washington, John Adams, and then finally Thomas Jefferson, and that will be your whole unit here, and then you guys will take a test on that.